Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the BIA Knowledge Leadership Series webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in the listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded Thursday, June 18th, 2015. I would now like to turn the webinar over to Robin Thompson. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of the team at BIA, we'd like to welcome you to our June Knowledge Leadership Series webinar, where our guest speaker is going to talk with us today about the Internet of Things and its impact on eDiscovery. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give a couple of reminders. We do not currently offer CLE credits for our webinars. A certificate of attendance will be automatically provided to those attending this event for your use in self-reporting. Such credit as CLE, CPE, CRM, IGP, and SEDS, and other professional educational attendance. If you have any questions for us about this process, please write us at edu@biaprotect.com. A couple of reminders, as Beatrice said, please send your questions through the chat window, and Ignatius will get to those at the end of the program. As you leave today, you'll be prompted to answer a short survey. From your valuable feedback, we plan our webinar series such as programs today and improve our services to the community. And now it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. Ignatius Grande is a senior discovery attorney with the global firm of Hughes Hubbard and Reed. He received his JD from Georgetown University Law Center and his BA from Yale College. As senior discovery attorney at Hughes Hubbard and Reed, Ignatius advises case teams and clients on how to best leverage the latest technologies and eDiscovery practices to efficiently guide matters from initial document preservation and collection through to review and production. Ignatius is an author and frequent speaker on the topics of electronic discovery and social media law. Ignatius is a member of the Sedona Conference Working Group on Electronic Document Retention and Production, serves as co-chair of the New York State Bar Association's Social Media Law Committee, and teaches a course on eDiscovery at St. John's University School of Law. And with that, I would like to turn the program over to you, Ignatius.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks to BIA for putting this together. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Internet of Things this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you are. And I think that this is a fascinating topic, and really, I think a term that's only become popular or really something that everyone has heard about, maybe even just within the last year. But I really do think that it is going to be, this form of technology is going to change the way that we live. Similar to the way that cell phones have changed the way that we communicate, and that the internet has changed the way that we get information. I really think that the Internet of Things is going to dramatically change the way that we exist, the way that companies operate, and I think that it's an exciting time, I think, for attorneys and for companies to understand, if you can understand these issues before problems are created, I think you're going to be in an advantage in your sector, whatever it may be. So we're going to start with as Robin mentioned, I work with eDiscovery, which we're going to talk about today, also social media, and just generally in litigation. And I really think that this little change to the ABA rules a couple years ago really sent the message and continues to send the message that, whether it's attorneys or people that work with attorneys, you need to understand the relevant technology that's out there and how it affects the way you operate. I would say for corporations, it's a no-brainer that you need to know how technology affects your operations and also affects the legal ramifications of what you're doing. These issues we're going to talk about are really just starting to come up more and more, and the reason is that this technology is quickly spreading in ways that we hadn't imagined and will continue to spread in ways that we can't imagine today. So just moving on, location, and I think for those that practice in eDiscovery, those that deal with information governance, this is becoming this chart just gives us a picture of how complicated the discussion, the analysis of the information that an individual is creating, or in particular that a company is creating, is becoming more and more challenging to get your hands on. And I always like this slide, and I think it, in some ways, when we're talking about the Internet of Things, we're going into three dimensions and talking about a dimension above even this analysis. But if you start back maybe 10 years ago or even 6 years ago, really you were focused on the pictures in the middle, emails, documents, and either hard copy files or even just files on your computer, maybe stuff that's on a server, data that's on a server. And now it goes to that next circle, and it has for some time now, where it's thumb drives that may have information that can be very relevant in cases, and is very relevant in some of the cases I'm working on right now. Telephone voicemails, other CDs, calendar entries, iPhones, contact lists, and forms of messages, which then gets to the next circle, which you start getting into webmail, Cisco Jabber, a work or a messaging system that can be put in place by a company, WhatsApp, which is just an app that people will use to communicate via messaging. I don't even have up here our Snapchat, which is maybe one of the newer ones. We have YouTube, Salesforce, communicating by social media. And I think just to take a second on this slide, what I found over the year to year is that in analyzing a given case, from a litigation context and looking at what data may be relevant, it really has become a challenge to ask the right questions and to look in the right places to collect what is relevant. And again, it used to be you collect the emails, you collect the files from a computer, maybe the shared folders on a server, and you're set. But more often than not, you're going to find clients that are communicating by personal email, even though they're not supposed to, or they're sending text messages, either known or unknown to the company. Sometimes it's a company system, and we've seen examples that have come up in the news of the use of Bloomberg messaging in the LIBOR case. Another example, I think recently, also in connection with the LIBOR case, there was WhatsApp messages. So there's a lot of data that's being created, a lot of places that we need to look, and the good, depending upon how you look at it, the good or bad news is that it's only going to get more complicated, and that is because of the Internet of Things. And so what is the Internet of Things? We have it defined here: everyday objects network connectivity to each other and or to humans, allowing them to send and receive data and perform a corresponding action. So, another way to describe that is it's becoming much easier for individual items or sensors to have network connectivity, to connect to the Internet. And you all have seen that, whether you realize it or not. You're starting to see that in different ways. Pretty much if you're buying any new appliances or new devices, more often than not, they're connected to the Internet. And companies are realizing it's much easier than ever before to have these sensors that can send data remotely to perhaps another machine or to somewhere where they're going to be tracked. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works. But just some of the numbers to think about: 26 billion connected devices is the number that's predicted by 2020. 1.9 trillion in global economic value add by 2020. 9 trillion in annual sales by 2020. And a recent survey found that 75% of executives were exploring or adopting Internet of Things technologies. So, this is not a little issue that's affecting some companies, some people, but it's really something that's going to be affecting the whole world and everyone within short order. And this gives you a picture. I like this chart because it shows you kind of where we were back in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and that's when I was really starting to get into this field full time, and back then it was PCs, servers, especially for individuals we're looking at here, but PCs. You can see really just a little sliver by 2006, 2007 that smartphones were starting to have data. And you can remember the early BlackBerries and other devices, you really had limited data on them, maybe some messaging, not the apps that we're used to today. And you can see, with the advent of the iPhone and development of Android devices, between 2010 to now, and then in the upcoming years, there's more and more data that's being saved onto iPhones. I'm pretty sure my current iPhone has more hard drive storage than my computer 5 years ago, let alone 15 years ago. So at any rate, smartphones, tablets, tablets are just a portion, but even that's is growing somewhat, but it's going to be relatively limited. But you look at the number of devices now connecting to the Internet of Things as part of this equation. This is again, this is of devices connected to the Internet, and you can see 2010 is when it really starts, and pretty soon it's going to be maybe half, if not more, of the devices that are connected to the Internet. So, what are we talking about here? What are Internet of Things devices? And and whether you realize it or not, you have seen them. Some of you have used them. Car dash cameras have been in place for a couple of years, but a better example are thermostats. You have the Nest thermostat, which is one of the more popular ones, but there are a number of companies, Honeywell and I believe Quirky, other companies, GE, that will have these thermostats that will connect to the Internet, that you can operate remotely, and the way, in fact, I'm getting one of these set up within the next couple of months, and you can, as long as you have a wireless connection, the thermostat can connect to the wireless connection, and then depending upon how it's set up, you may be able to operate it from your iPhone or from a computer terminal, from the Internet. Manufacturing monitors, I'll talk about that a little bit. You're having a lot of companies that little by little are realizing, again, as I said, you can have these monitors or devices that can gather information and collect it and send it to another place or send it online. And we'll give a couple of examples of that, but that's another area that is growing. Wearable activity trackers and health monitors. I'm sure a high percentage of the people on the webinar have Fitbits or something similar. Google Glass is another example, and who knows what the future iterations of that will be. Security devices for homes and devices for seniors. That's another area that I've started to see a lot of this. I serve on the board of a senior citizen center, and there's more and more devices that are created to help seniors live on their own. Whether it be providing, you always know the location, or if a device has stopped moving, that they may have fallen, or cameras so that that someone may be at their seat, helping to remember to take pills, It really runs the gamut. And at this point, I think companies that are in the Internet of Things arena, it's almost a matter of brainstorming ideas, because the technology is there, and it's really finding the applications that will have that a lot of people will see as valuable and will be popular. I think another one I don't have listed here are refrigerators, which is another area where this technology, there's talk of it being implemented. I think it has on some refrigerators. The idea being you have a spot where you put your milk. If you're out of milk, you may get a notice on your phone, or notice you have to buy milk when you pass a supermarket or a Rite Aid. There could be other features as well, and an alarm if the temperature goes too low, if something's happened. But whether that becomes worth the effort and people like that remains to be seen. But I think a lot of these devices, when you think about it, you think of them all in context, it almost reminds you of the Jetsons and the way just everything kind of is connected together. It's a very futuristic world. We're not quite there yet, but it's happening quickly. We just put in a new TV, and it has wireless connectivity and can do certain things. I don't believe it has a voice activation, but it may, and definitely future TVs are coming out with that, and I'll mention the ramifications of that in a bit. But yeah, TVs. I had a new receiver for my stereo system that was connected to the internet. It really, as new things, it's very easy to do that, and there are benefits. There's some drawbacks as well, but it's something to think about. And just quickly, this is a snapshot of some of these devices that are out there. There's a Fitbit on the bottom right. You have an Apple Watch in the middle. On the left, that's an example of it's a technology that is out there, but I think will likely become even more popular. It's almost like a sticker you might put on your skin that can do, as the Fitbit, maybe you can monitor blood pressure or can monitor your pulse, and that, believe it or not, has connectivity to the internet. There are chips that are small enough to be embedded in that, and obviously the future rollouts of that and what it may detect, who knows. And then there are a bunch of those up in the top left and the top right, which I experienced a couple months ago, are these bands that Disney has implemented at most, if not all, of their theme parks, where you check into your hotel. Instead of getting a card for the hotel, especially if you're on site at their parks, they give you this armband that will stay on your arm your whole visit. It will let you into your hotel room. It will allow you to purchase things. It'll be connected to your credit card, so you could pay for lunch, pay for dinner. You could pay for Mickey Mouse ears. And it also will allow you to get onto rides. When you have a fast pass that lets you cut the line, you can use it. But they don't really make this that visible in the welcome letter when you receive them in the mail. They track your location, and obviously they're tracking all of your purchasing habits. So you may, when they'll know, they can detect with the RFID chip at any given time where you're located. Obviously, there's some benefits to that if you have it on your child and you lose track of your child, which hopefully would never happen. But obviously, there's a lot of information that's being collected, and many people don't necessarily know that. And and another part of this is that all these devices and what they capture is going to more and more become interconnected. And so this is an example. You have an iPhone, and I know one of the companies that's working on this. I know Quirky and GE have I believe an app that will help connect a lot of the devices that come out together. So you have an iPhone app. You can, with that app, check on your appliances. You can turn off your lights. You could change the temperature on your thermostat. You could check the camera on your backyard. And really it's who knows? Obviously it could be much more than that. It's a matter of the devices being out there. and connecting them together. So, I know there are a lot of people in the webinar that may work for companies or represent companies, and you may say, well, this is all nice, interesting, but really, how does it affect corporate America, and why is this important there? Number one, it's easier to put these devices in place than ever before, so it's just easier for them to be adopted in different ways, whether it be on a personal level or on a corporate company level. But looking at kind of the devices that a company may use, a lot of these can help to reduce costs. They can make your processes more efficient. They can help prevent human errors, which can be very important, and they can safeguard against lost or stolen assets. So, I think what's helpful is to think of some examples of how this can happen. So, on this slide, we mentioned a couple of examples that are, actually out there being used by companies. Oil field tracking. There are companies that can put sensors on their machinery that can send alerts with data for technicians to troubleshoot or fix issues remotely. So you may say, oh, well, that's nice, but what does that really lead to? Well, what it leads to is 50% decrease in required site visits, reduced labor, vehicle, and fuel costs of sending people out there to check or to make fixes to machinery or to machinery or to something at a factory. And then it also will decrease the time required for diagnostics and repair. You're going to get a real-time notice that something isn't operating, as opposed to maybe finding something out well after it's gone down because no one realized or didn't affect anything else. Other examples, there's a chemical company that has put in place a wireless sensor system that helps to monitor the location and condition of rail cars that they use to transport their most hazardous products. GE uses sensors mounted in jet engines combined with predictive algorithms to predict about with a 70% accuracy when an engine is going to require maintenance up to a month in advance. And another, I have it on here just because I think it's fascinating, but not necessarily a corporate application, but possibly. But street lights now, even they've come out with street lights that have sensors that can detect information. This is more of a law enforcement issue of detecting crime or something happening that perhaps shouldn't be happening. But it is really interesting to think of all the ways that this can be used. And you think about corporations and how there are obviously a number of other ways that these sensors can be rolled out. You may have sensors to detect when people have entered the office, or if they're in a room, maybe a light sensor that tracks when the light's on or off. You may have video cameras that are now collecting real-time information. And again, any of these sensors that we just talked about, you can think of all the ways a company may, that builds things or designs things could have these sensors in place to help make things more efficient, make things run more efficiently. So how does this relate to eDiscovery? Number one, kind of going back to one of the early slides, there's so many more sources of data now than ever before, and by adding this whole Internet of Things concept to the equation, you're dealing with really almost multiplying the sources of data. All this data is not in the same place. You don't know how it's saved. And just to go to the other questions, how to identify the sources? What are they? As someone who deals with information governance, eDiscovery, or simply just deals with the data a company's creating, it's very easy to put in place some of these new devices, these new sensors. It's not in many cases not like putting a new database online. It's something that maybe could be done relatively cheaply, depending on what you're doing. And just knowing all the sources that a company maybe all the data they may be collecting could be difficult, and unless there's some measures in place to know when an office or a division puts in place new technology, new sensors that are collecting this data, it's very possible the in-house department, the IT department, may not know that they exist, that they're being used. And from an eDiscovery perspective, data is data, and I think there's a tendency to focus on the email data and on the electronic documents and to analyze that. And it's true, there's still a lot of information there, but as time goes on, and you can kind of see it from that picture earlier, but just generally that's becoming is going to become a much smaller percentage of what may be relevant in a case. And, we're not quite there where you're collecting all this Internet of Things data and producing it, but, from an eDiscovery perspective, I think the important thing to take away is you need to think about preservation and how so you may have some of these technologies that you might not even know exist as someone who's in-house or someone who's at a company, and that's data that needs to be preserved. And maybe it is being saved, but if it's only being kept for a short period of time and you don't preserve it, you're going to run into problems. Who controls the data? Where is the data? That's another question to think about. You have data, for a lot of these devices is probably in the cloud somewhere and you can access it, but where is it in the cloud? What's the format of the data? It may be also stuff that is being preserved or collected, on a server somewhere else, but you need to know where is the data, who controls the data. Is it can the company access it? Can only certain people? Can maybe just someone from the Internet of Things company really access the data to the full extent? And what's the format? If you're using these, how can you export the data? It isn't an email, it isn't a document. It's going to be in some sort of a spreadsheet form perhaps, but you have video data, you have a lot of these sensors are collecting all different kinds of information. So that's a challenge. And how do you collect and review the data? If it's not in an easy way to export, it may be difficult to even know what you're dealing with. And I encourage, if anyone's on the phone has any questions, I know with a webinar it's not always easy to have a conversation, and I don't like hearing myself speak for too long, but I guess I'll survive for a little longer. But if you have questions, please, and please give them to us. I'll be happy to end a little early to answer any questions. So, Brown versus Tellermate. I just think this opinion was written last year in 2014. I think it's just a harbinger of things to come as far as how courts will look at this when it does become something that is being challenged by plaintiffs in cases or is being used in cases, this sort of data. But Brown versus Tellermate, I should say, it does not relate to Internet of Things data, but what it does deal with is data that's preserved or stored on the cloud. And what happened in this case is you had a company that had a sales department, and the information that what they did was relevant to a lawsuit, and they had in place a program called Salesforce, which some of you or many of you are familiar with. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Salesforce is a program that basically collects sales information. It may collect communications by sales representatives. It may track different opportunities, different accounts, communications with different accounts. Really a lot of information could be in there. So in this case, the plaintiffs had asked that this information be produced, and actually specifically asked that it be preserved. And the defendants pushed back at this, said, hey, we don't have possession, custody, or control of this information, and they didn't export, they didn't look to preserve the data, despite being asked to several times. And the cloud provider, as it turned out, only maintained backups of this data for a couple of months, 3 to 6 months. The court, and by the time they were, I think, forced to produce this, the data that they produced was lacking and didn't have everything that was there at the beginning of the lawsuit. The court said counsel has an affirmative obligation to speak to the key players at the company so that counsel and client together can identify, preserve, and search the sources of discoverable information. The court then sanctioned the defendant and the counsel and precluded the defendant from using that defense from in the case that related to the sales data. So, again, this is maybe a narrow holding, but it's out there, and a lot of this happened because the company was given kind of a preservation notice and declined to do so, and then the court determined the information was relevant to the case. But you look at Internet of Things technology, and you don't want to get in a situation where there's information out there that arguably is key or relevant to a case that hasn't been preserved. And it's unclear how a court will react, but this case is out there, so it's something to be careful about. So, the one other thing, there's the eDiscovery part of this, which I think is fascinating and is only going to become more and more of a challenge for companies and for lawyers and for eDiscovery vendors. But separately or related, you're looking at a lot of privacy issues that these devices are creating, and I think from a corporate perspective, you want to make sure that you have the correct policies in place and that they are covering all of the possible ramifications of these devices, of mobile devices, but now more than that of these other devices. And that's something which I've been working on a lot lately for our clients, and is dealing with these sort of policies. And oftentimes it may be a privacy policy, but it can be part of a retention policy. But really, you look at BYOD policies, and that's addressing some of these issues when people are using their own devices. I was talking to someone yesterday about this, and it's become more and more of a challenge because oftentimes you have to, or are in a position where you're being required to collect cell phone information, in particular messages and voicemails and any text app messages. And in a lot of contexts with BYOD devices or other devices that have work and personal information on them, you're often collecting a whole lot more than you need or that the individual wants you to be collecting. So it is important. I really think it's crucial these days to have a BYOD policy in place if that's in fact what you're doing. Notice and consent. You need to, if you are collecting information, if you're at a company where you're collecting certain information about individuals, you need to understand, do they need to be given notice? Do they need to consent to the information that's being collected? Example that I've noted down below are health fitness challenges. It could be someone, you sign up your Apple phone or your Fitbit to kind of do a challenge that seems like a fun thing. You get a prize, or you get a happy hour, and what if that data is being collected and used for other reasons? Companies need to be aware of that, make sure they're not violating laws when doing so. The Apple Watch is now making it even easier to kind of use apps on a real-time basis and to access information and to collect information about your health. And there are a lot of apps now that can be used on the Apple Watch. And tracking bracelets, like we talked about that, the magic bands. I think it's more and more you're going to find these sort of bracelets that are tracking a lot of information, your every move, and what do you need to consent? What does that consent need to look like? You may consent for thinking it's for one reason, and then have that information be used for something else. An example is just even with Siri on the iPhone, how you have it's in place so that you can maybe dictate stuff or ask questions, but it came out recently that there's a third party collects all that information. It's not your private information, so you may not know that is being used by a company that's culling it for helpful information, but it is. And for those that have had intimate conversations with Siri, you should look into that. But moving on to security issues, which really in a lot of ways overlaps with privacy issues. A recent survey showed that in adopting these Internet of Things technologies, the top issues that are of concern are security and personal privacy, data privacy issues, and simply protection from attacks from hackers. And the FTC has been one of the agencies in the government that deals with these sort of issues in different ways, and has tried to have workshops that will address different ramifications. I included in the materials, which I think you can access if you either access on the webinar or you'll receive a report that the FTC issued earlier this year. It's entitled "Privacy and Security in a Connected World," and just wanted to touch on some of these issues, but it's a bit long, but it is a paper that you can read to think about some of the different ramifications of the security and privacy ramifications of these new technologies. I think, and in fact, there's a one consent order that the FTC entered into, which has been written about quite a bit. It's actually a couple of years ago now. It was called the TrendNet case, the TrendNet consent order, and in that case, you had a company that was collecting video feeds. You had cameras that would you could access your camera device on the internet, and it was great. The problem was they didn't put in place the proper security protocols, and this data ended up being kind of freely available online. I believe some of it was hacked or was taken, and it was information. It could be from a crib of a child or whatever it may have been, but it was supposed to have been properly taken care of, properly secured, and it was not. And that company had to enter into a consent order that requires them to kind of check in with the FTC for either 10 or 20 years as far as the protocols that they're putting in place. I think it is important for these, if you are using one of these technologies, or especially the company adopting something, to make sure that the company that you're dealing with knows, how to deal with these issues. And it's a challenge to know the right questions to ask, but you do want to make sure that you're not getting into something that, if it's very important private information that's being collected, or personal information, that it's not, in a position where it could be released more broadly, and that might raise issues. And then the last 2 points here, Samsung TVs. It was, I think, within a matter of a couple of days where this was the Samsung TV issue came out, but it was Samsung was releasing these new TVs that will have voice activation software, and they had a press release saying that we wanted to make clear that information, we do share that information with third-party vendors, and it created a bit of an uproar. And how it's being used, it wasn't clear. Maybe nothing that was that dramatic, but still, people who use those TVs, I think the idea was it may be on, even if you're not using it to change the channel, and it was collecting information, conversations within the house. And then driverless cars. There was also something around the same time. It was, I think, on 60 Minutes about driverless cars and potential security issues that if someone could hack into your car and drive you off a cliff, and that there was concern about that. I think it's a little early to get concerned about that sort of issue, but it does raise these issues of what could the security ramifications be for some of these devices, this technology, and it could be pretty severe. There's a lot of talk in Washington about how to regulate Internet of Things technologies, and I think there's some voices that do say if you put in place stringent regulations, you're going to snuff out the innovation and the new devices that are being created and released. But time will tell how the regulations will apply to this. And I think we're up to Q&A. So do we have any questions?
We have quite a few today. You've given us some great information, so let me start off with our first questions. Do you see the Internet of Things being more of an issue in specific types of litigations more than others? For example, Facebook and Twitter collections tend to be used more often in employment than other types of cases, in my experience, and I'm just wondering if there's a certain type of case you'd recommend we'd be more alert for these sources of data than others.
Yeah, I do think it's more of a focus. I do think it's more of the bigger issue is preservation and figuring out what data may be relevant to a given case. But as far as what types of litigation, again, that it could really run the gamut. You're talking about these devices that companies may put into place. I think if you look at a corporate, it could be an oil spill or some sort of an accident at a plant. I mean, I think a lot of those sort of issues are the types of litigations where you really want to think about this. But as far as kind of the more personal devices, you're going to think about a case where someone, we're not quite there, but a case where someone says their health was affected and they didn't, weren't able to get around as well as they used to. There hasn't been a case where a judge has admitted Fitbit evidence, and there's at this point would be a lot of challenges to prove that you in fact held the Fitbit during that period of time, and that it was measuring you yourself. But it is a matter of time until that could be, you could have something that would match to your DNA or somehow prove that it was measuring your heart rate during a whole period of time or your activity level. So I mean, I think that sort of case, personal injury sort of cases, I do think it's something interesting to think about. Probably not quite there yet that's going to be relevant. And I think employment actions, again, you talk about Facebook and Twitter being used in employment actions. I do think some of these technologies could be relevant if it is a question of when someone was working in an overtime case and a company can track in some way when a person came into the office and left the office. You're going to want to make sure you're preserving that information, and that could be relevant.
Your discussion today made me think of a personal issue. I own a Fitbit and wear it, and a citizen of the United States. And let's say I go over to Europe and generate data there, and it becomes the subject of litigation. Are these devices subject to European Union, EU considerations? Does ownership of the data change by the location of where the data is produced on an item such as a Fitbit?
That's a good question. I don't believe that's been resolved quite yet, but I think you raise an important point, which is, if this technology becomes widespread in the near future, what will that lead to? What will the ramifications be for the EU and the kind of the differences that we already face on data privacy issues and data? So I think if you think of a Fitbit, you go to Europe and you come back. I mean, right now it's all really is part of your collected for yourself. I can't imagine that you'd run into data privacy issues there. But I think that I do think someone who's in the EU and as these as more and more data is being collected about people, there's going to be increased, and there has been, but I think there'll be going to be increased focus and perhaps regulations about how this data can be used, and notice that people have to be given as far as what's being collected about them. And I think it's hard for our government to keep up, and it's the same in the EU and other countries. I think the technology is changing so quickly that oftentimes it takes a while for the politicians or the regulators to even understand what's being collected, what is happening before it can be regulated. I always give an example that on my iPhone, there's an app that has a little heart on it, and if for those of you who have an iPhone 6, if you haven't looked at it, if you go and open it, it's collecting information about your activity level, how many steps you've walked up, how many steps you've taken, and a couple of other features, not heart rate because it's on the phone, but that collects information. I never put it on; it was just there. It collects information. I'm sure it's being collected by someone, and potentially, it doesn't really at this point raise issues in the U.S., but in the EU, you can see how other countries with a strict data privacy regime, with those sort of apps or applications, pretty quickly could start getting concerned.
It's fairly nascent, and I can see a lot of implications for wearing these devices, even from the employer standpoint, for remote employees saying they were active when perhaps they weren't. I think we've got time for another question or two, and I'm going to bundle these two together because they seem related. The first one says, given autos today, they have their own black boxes along with detailed data they store. What rights do individuals have to restrict access? And I want to tie that in, Ignatius, to a program I saw last night on Shark Tank. They were talking about a device called the Smart Wheel that several kids had invented. It is a snap-on device onto the wheel of a car that monitors hand position, whether you're texting, driving with one hand, etc., to send that data back to perhaps their parents or to another unit. So with those two devices, what rights do individuals have to restrict access to this data, if any?
Yeah, I mean, you have to know what you're agreeing to. I think if let's say you get a new car and it has that black box, you may have to dig, but there's going to be an agreement that there should be, and that's part of the regulations that are coming out and either have come out or will come out that address that. I believe if you had a black box that stored detailed information, it depends what it is. I would say it does depend a little bit on what it's collecting, whether you would really have any right to restrict access. I think there are some tracking devices that are put into cars that are intended to provide the not to get information about you per se, but more about the cars and the efficiency of the cars and issues like that. But even in those situations, I'm pretty sure that when you buy the car, there probably is some small lettering that would that you acknowledge that technology may be there. As far as the Smart Wheel, that's something that would be a more specific device that's put into place. And you're going to, in that situation, again, there would have to be some sort of consent as far as what is being collected. Part of it's understanding what the technology is doing. If you put a Smart Wheel on your car and it's collecting information about hand positions and sending them somewhere, you need to know that that's what it does. As far as someone getting access to it, it would be up to you. As far as it going to really the question might be if it goes to a third party, do you have a right to that? And I think at this point, a lot of the information that is collected, like the Samsung TVs, can go to third parties unless you specifically, say that it can. And in some cases, you could say that it can't, and there's really no way to stop them from doing that. Your option is to not adopt that technology, and that's I think where we may see is, some people maybe become hesitant to use Internet of Things technologies because of the data that is being collected.
That's very interesting. What rights do others have that would be like a victim and insurer to gain access to these devices?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on how relevant the information is. It depends on what's being collected. In a car accident, if you have a new car that is collecting information that would be relevant to how an accident happened, I mean, that's going to be subject to discovery. And if it's recoverable and the other side knows it's there, you likely will have to produce it. As far as Fitbit information, again, I think we're not quite to the point where someone's going to produce or maybe request Fitbit information just because it can be very difficult to enter that into evidence or have that proven. There's one question here which just came up. Could you talk a bit about the form of collection and production of IoT data? Are there specific tools which address them? And this person said, I know of X1. And yeah, I think X1 is a company. We actually use them for some preservation, and they I would say they are more focused right now on social media, internet technology. To be able to what we're talking about here is really it's almost. It is going to be a challenge because it's not, even with social media pages or internet pages, I think a lot of people don't know how to preserve that, but it's not that difficult to do so if you do work with a vendor, and there are a number of them out there that will help you in preservation, in preserving social media, including BIA. But for some of these forms of technology, it's more, I think it can be more akin to a database where you have a lot of information. It may not be even in a format that can be exported for an individual or for certain devices. So, part of the challenge is going to be for these devices, especially some that may be relevant in litigation or investigations, to be able to export in a proper way that a eDiscovery vendor can work with.
You have given us some absolutely amazing information today on this topic that we're hearing more and more about. I want to thank, on behalf of the team at BIA, I want to thank everyone who attended today's program for your valuable time in spending your lunch with us. You can learn more about the rest of our 2015 series of programs by logging on to our website, www.biaprotect.com, at the education page. Next month, we'll be joined by Linda Corrett, who's a nationwide expert in the topic of the role of the paralegal in eDiscovery. Lastly, I'd like to thank our special guest speaker today, Ignatius Grande of the firm of Hughes Hubbard and Reed, for your valuable time today in talking to us about the Internet of Things.